Hello, I'm Nevin Burns, and this slideshow is going to be discussing and comparing different ecological communities and specifically focusing on invasive species and their potential impacts. The areas of focus are Florida wetlands compared against Florida springs. This work was conducted while under study at Unity, Maine. A little bit of background into the project. Initially, I visited two areas, which was Sand Lake at Wekiwa Springs State Park and Orlando Wetlands Park. Katie's Landing at Wekiwa Springs was an additional location that I went to record population characteristics, as well as at Orlando Wetlands Park. A little bit of history on the two parks. Wekiwa Springs State Park is a naturally formed spring and has had recreational features since before Disney actually founded its establishment in Central Florida, so it has a great footprint here. Orlando Wetlands Park recently is one of the first man-made water reclamation centers that also provides a wonderful habitat for wildlife. And while we were there, we saw a great array of different species. It was incredible. I chose these two specific areas. One, based on the high level of biodiversity that I would find there. I knew that that would be easier to find species to compare, find the one that would be most interesting to me, more or less, as well as one that I could research and develop findings that could be beneficial and educational to others. Two, I additionally chose it to test my hypothesis, which is based on the assumption that with Wekiwa Springs State Park there was going to be higher foot traffic, which would in cases possibly bring in exotic species. So it was most also for the high foot traffic in the area. Each location was about 40 minutes from my house, so the weather was pretty constant when I was at both of them, so that was a constant in my project. However, while I was at Wekiwa Springs at Sand Lake, I did see some harvester ants that I decided not to interact with to prevent myself from bites. So my overall hypothesis was that Wekiwa Springs State Park would contain a higher number of invasive plant species, where Orlando Wetlands Park would contain a higher number of invasive aquatic species. As I was saying, it was under the simple assumption that more foot traffic at Wekiwa Springs State Park and more pets could possibly bring in exotic species, intentionally or unintentionally, like on your pants, like hitchhikers or in pet's fur, or intentionally, which would be devastating. We also looked at Orlando Wetlands Park, thinking it would have a higher number of invasive aquatic species. Having access to the larger rivers like St. John's, I would assume more species to be able to come into the Orlando Wetlands Park area where it's secluded and less trafficked area, so it is a great spot for species to thrive and flourish without a lot of human interaction. And I conducted I test the hypothesis by observing and identifying as many species as I could throughout the parks, while also determining species richness and evenness through the Shannon Index, as well as collecting and researching my findings and data in order to estimate the overall health of the ecological communities based on the potential impacts that would be coming from any invasive species found. So, while at Wekiwa Springs State Park, initially, as I said, I just studied Sand Lake, walked the trails around the lake, identifying plants and other species, using an app or if I couldn't identify it through the app, I would photograph it and research it for another time to identify it. Now, while conducting findings for population characteristics, I specifically chose Pistia stratiotes. So I discovered that Wekiwa Springs State Park didn't have any at this Sand Lake, which was a very small ecological community. I decided to reroute over to a boat launch, a recreational boat launch called Katie's Landing that did have Pistia stratiotes. And Orlando Wetlands Park, while I was there, I had a inflatable canoe that I would do my best to keep the Pistia stratiotes on the right of me, picking them up and laying them flat on the side of my canoe with a ruler to calculate the length. And then I would place it on the left side of my canoe to avoid possibly remeasuring any samples. Here are the figures and graphs that I took from each location at Wekiwa Springs and Orlando Wetlands Park. So figure 1 and figure 3 are both from Wekiwa Springs, Sand Lake, and Katie's Landing, while figures 2A, 2B, and 2C are from Orlando Wetlands Park. And we'll discuss those further throughout the slideshow. So here is a rough placement of where these species were observed, and the pictures are rough indicational sizes of how influential that species population was in the community. There's gray catbirds that I observed, green sunfish, I believe it was western banded hoverflies, saw palmettos, Salvinia natans in the center below the gopher tortoise is one of the invasive species that I recorded at Sand Lake. While at Orlando Wetlands Park, I'll play the video, I noticed in the video a bald eagle, which was incredible. I've never observed a bald eagle in the wild before, so that was a great opportunity that I definitely did not take for granted. We also saw great blue herons, alligators, cypress trees. Water lettuce was one of the more pest species that we found. It's also considered invasive, but it's a long story. We'll get into it. Also broadleaf arrowheads, snakebirds, and other herons as well. So as I said, the two species that I identified that are considered invasive was Salvinia natans and Pistia stratiotes. Salvinia natans was most likely introduced into the U.S. in the 1980s when it was imported from, I believe, Asia as a novelty aquarium vegetation, and I'm assuming that somebody most likely dumped it from their fish tank, not realizing that it was going to be creating such an ecological impact, that it traveled from New England all the way down to Florida, if it was the standalone case. Pistia stratiotes, as I said, is endemic to Florida. However, it does have pests-like qualities where it will cover water surface areas, blocking waterways. It's very annoying in the boating community, and well known for its harm that it can cause to boats. So I wanted to research a little bit more as to the impact they have below the water, potentially towards other species and other plant species and whatnot. So that was specifically what piqued my interest. Referencing the figures from it was Sand Lake and the 3 other ecological communities at Orlando Wetlands Park, using the percent coverage that I estimated and the species richness, I was able to complete the Shannon Diversity Index equation for each of those graphed areas and develop a species evenness for each one. So figure 1, which was Sand Lake, is mostly dominated by Salvinia, so it has a lower species evenness. While figure 2A, I believe, had around 7 or 8 species, so a species richness of 7 or 8, without a heavily dominating species, so it had a pretty relative species evenness, while 2B and 2C at Orlando Wetlands Park were heavily dominated by Pistia stratiotes, like it shows 80% and 90% at the 2 locations. So, as I said, I wanted to document and research and compare root lengths of Pistia stratiotes in both ecological communities. So, on the left at Wekiwa Springs State Park, this histogram shows that the average is around 10 to 12 inches, give or take. There's a lower dip at 11 inches, which it seems that it is associated with the depth of the water, because while at Orlando Wetlands Park, you can see that there is a higher average, around 15, 16, 17 inches, where the water depth at Orlando Wetlands Park was about 2.5 to 3 feet. So it appears that Pistia stratiotes roots are far-reaching, attempting to reach down to the sediment bottom, or as best as they can, to leach nutrients, essentially. This is bad for other species, submerged or surface vegetation. It's devoiding a lot of the ecological community from its nutrients, and also it has a issue of oxygen depletion in the water as well. So it seems pretty invasive. We'll continue looking at that throughout these. So it's been labeled a pest species specifically, as well as even occasionally invasive, because of its ability to withstand intense temperature fluctuations, long periods of seed survival through sometimes ice and dried mud, rapid fragmentation, sprouting new buds almost every month, with very natural few enemies. So as we can read, it reproduces rapidly by vegetative fragmentation from offshoots on short, brittle stolons. The seeds can be dispersed by water and sink into the mud. They float, and that's when the primary leaf is developed, is when they start to float. And they produce several stolons that are about 60 centimeters in length. Is really well acquainted for Florida rivers and ponds with very slow-moving waters. They're very warm. It's a great germination spot for a lot of their species. So with that, it's doesn't seem to have issues with intraspecific competition. However, in situations with competition, it has been documented to flourish essentially with other species. So it is definitely a nutrient leacher and can be harmful in areas if it does become too large of a population. So as I was saying, there are negative effects. There are positive impacts that they have, such as water remediation. They can decrease the amount of harmful nutrients in the water, such as nitrogen and other harmful chemicals. However, Pistia stratiotes can also harbor mosquito nurseries. As I said earlier, it decreases oxygen levels, blocks waterways, interferes with agricultural hydro farming. It can increase harmful chemicals and bacteria. It'll decrease plankton species diversity, pH, increases alkalinity, kills fish nests and other fish and macroinvertebrates. and you can see on the graph how large they have dispersed. They are essentially global, aside from Asia, India, and Northern Africa, and some of Northern America as well. Population management is limited, but it is definitely workable. Physical management is removing or raking Pistia stratiotes. There is large swaths of Pistia stratiotes often. However, it is manageable to be able to rake it and pull it out and clear at least some of it from the area. Very easy. Biological management, I would say we should research the potential impacts of introducing another species, but that would be a biological approach to managing the species with the leaf weevil, which is one of its natural enemies, along with a particular moth. And finally, there's herbicide management, which is highly discouraged because it's going to further decrease oxygen within the water, as well as altering water chemistry, increasing harmful chemicals that will also have further dire consequences based on like fish mortality and all of that. So, with this project finished at this point, to be picked up and continued in the future, I would suggest to continue monitoring Pistia stratiotes populations, recording their sizes and locations, as well as their root lengths, to continue seeing how invasive they are to the point that we can't see. Determine the mortality and fecundity rate in order to determine the population growth rate, to be able to predict and plan ahead and be proactive about these if there are potential blooms that might be upcoming. As I said, research the conditional impacts that may come with introducing another species. I forgot to check, but I do not know if the leaf weevil is in Florida or is endemic to Florida, so I will have to double check on that. Documenting, we should also be documenting the pH and oxygen levels around the Pistia stratiotes populations in order to see and determine the impacts that they are causing within these ecological communities. And that is all, and those are my references. Thank you for watching.